activities. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the program, and it's a nice link with the evaluation actually, because Miss Naomi Levine is the only speaker over the last 5 years or 6 years, I believe, who consistently received 100% rating. You know that already. I told you that last year. We all have high expectations.
That makes me feel great.
Now, Naomi Levine is a special advisor to the president of New York University. She's also the chair and the executive director of the George Hyman Center for Philanthropy and Fundraising at New York University. For 22 years, Ms. Levine was the Senior Vice President for External Affairs at NYU, where she was in charge of development and fundraising, but also of press and public relations, of alumni relations, and of all events that were relating to alumni, trustees, donors. An important position, obviously, a key position, and in New York, Naomi Levine is widely recognized as the person, the driving force who really, together obviously with the various presidents of NYU, was able to develop NYU in the institution that it is today, because when Ms. Levine joined the New York University, it was a much smaller institution than it is today, and sometimes we tend to forget that. Now, previously, Ms. Levine was the executive director of the American Jewish Congress. In terms of background, Ms. Levine is a lawyer. She graduated from Columbia Law School, not from NYU, where she was the editor of the Law Review. She's an expert in constitutional law. So without further ado, thank you so much, Naomi, for being with us again for the opening of this program.
When I was asked to make this speech, I thought it was going to be very easy, because I've spoken here 3 or 4 times before. I thought I'd just take last year's speech out of the drawer and just use it again. It would be a very simple thing. The truth is that in the last year or so, there have been some major changes in the field of philanthropy, in the face of philanthropy, and while, as you see as I move on, that I believe there are certain basics that remain the same, I thought it would be useful to start by telling you some of the changes that we see here and in Europe. The first thing that's happening that really is amazing is that while we're going through a great economic crisis throughout the world, there is an enormous amount of money on the top. In the United States alone, there are 403 billionaires. Now, keep in mind, when I first joined the world of philanthropy, if you were a millionaire, that was a big deal. But now there are billionaires. I don't even know how many zeros go into the billion, but all I know is it's a lot of money. And besides the United States, I have here numbers that in the Middle East and Africa, there are 65. In Europe, there are 248 billionaires. And in the last issue of Forbes magazine, that used to be a magazine that listed the millionaires, now they list the billionaires. And if you go through it, you'll see that Spain has 13, that France has 12, that Germany has 53, that Great Britain has 29, and you'll be amazed at the number of billionaires. Besides there being a lot of billionaires, there are millions and millions of millionaires. What bothers me, and it has really nothing to do with what I'm supposed to say today, is the money on the top seems to be increasing, but the money on the bottom is getting less and less. And I would hope that sometime you would get together with some economists and try to figure out why that's happening and what you could do in some fashion to lessen that gap. But as fundraisers, all you have to know is that there is money around, and you have to find out where it is and how you reach it. The second development that's more recent is what we call the mega gifts. Now, when you used to get a gift of $1 million, when I get a gift of $1 million, the staff and I would go out and get drunk. Today, that's nothing. There are gifts that are I say here that Buffett announced a gift of $31 billion. That was unheard of in my time. And that organization by organization, will tell you that the size of some of the gifts are enormous, not only in this country, but in your countries, if you know where it is. Now, at NYU alone, last year, we received $165 million from Helen Kimmel. We received $200 million from Ken Langone and $50 million from Sylvia Hassenfeld. I can go down the list. So suddenly, mega gifts have become extraordinarily important. The third development that's kind of new, that was two that I mentioned, is that there are younger people involved in philanthropy. In my day, again, people started to give money in their late 50s, in their 60s, in their 70s, 80s. They would leave it in a will, in a charitable lead trust. Now you have young people who are making, in the world of technology, enormous money and are giving it much earlier. We have people that are giving in their 20s, in their 30s, and their 40s. The Times last week had a front page article, the New York Times, indicating that Facebook was going to buy a new startup by two young men in their 20s who got $1 billion from Facebook for what they did. And that is not unusual. I mean, it's not commonplace. You don't find it on every corner, but there's enough of these young tech people that are giving money to philanthropy that we never had before. So you have younger, and the problem with the younger crowd is that they give to their own specific projects. They do not, by and large, give to umbrella groups like United Way. They don't want to give to United Way. They want to give to their own specific project. There's something in the United States called the United Jewish Appeal, the UJA, the United Federations of the Federated Churches. They're getting a very hard time in facing these younger people. These younger people are giving a great deal to things that they pick out, that they want to support. In the Times today, it says you don't need a superhuman strength to rescue the planet. And they're giving awards or mentioning 6 or 7 young people who are, not 6 or 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. One person is mobilizing citizens in Russia to reroute a highway that would bisect Moscow's forest. There's somebody else in Kenya, a young person fighting the construction of the massive dam that will block access to water, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of money going into the environment, into political activism, and so a lot of the old-fashioned, what I called old-fashioned philanthropies, are facing that problem. Then, also, as I just mentioned, a lot of our donors in this country are giving overseas. They're giving to Africa, they're giving to Haiti, they're giving to problems that they feel affect the universe and its environment. Then there is the role of technology. Now, I'm technologically illiterate. On the other hand, I can't function without a Department of Technology and Social Media. I never go out on a fundraising call without having in my pocket everything there is to know about the person that I'm going to see. As a civil libertarian, I hate it. As a fundraiser, I can't do without it. And the ability of technology to give you that information is amazing. I have here a sheet of all the things that my office uses to tell me everything about you. If I wanted to waste time, I could have found out about everyone in this room, but I didn't have to do that because I didn't feel there were any mega gifts, you should forgive me, in the room, so maybe I'm mistaken, so I didn't do my homework. But they're online. There's LexisNexis. There are Hoover.com. There's Edgar.com, one of the most useful sites, which will provide documents electronically filed with the SEC. And those documents will give you the salaries of all the major executives in the United States, how much they owe, how much they have, and it's absolutely indispensable. And in our country, all of the 501c, the nonprofit organization, have to file a 990. They are available to you. Look, I get a 990. I can tell you what everybody at NYU in the top bracket earn. I can tell you our budget. I could look at it and tell you everything about the university's financial status. But there is a danger in technology. If you make one mistake, if you give excess salary, if there is some mismanagement in your organization, the media will grab it at once, it will be on the internet, and you will have a very difficult time in raising money. So they're good and bad with the technology. Everything is open. Everything is available for you. But there's good and bad when there are no limits to the lines on privacy that I always thought were very important. And the last thing that is changing a little bit the face of philanthropy is the role of women. Women in the United States today own 51% of the wealth of this country, and 65% of the stock exchange, the stocks bought and sold on the stock exchange today are owned by women. Women in this country have 6.2 million businesses, and many of them are high-income earners. You know that in this country, the head of IBM is now a woman, the head of Hewlett-Packard, the head of PepsiCo. The women in this country have moved up in the last years to very dramatic positions. So they not only earn bigger money, but they also inherit money. And I hope the men will forgive me when I report that I recently returned from Palm Beach in Florida, where there is probably more money per block than in any city in the United States. And there you will see that men in their second and third marriages, when they're 60, 70, and they have a lot of money, they marry women who are 30. And then the men die, and what happens, the women are inheriting the wealth. Now, ladies, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting you go to Palm Beach and find one of those men, I'm just reporting a fact to you. And as a result, this time that I went there, I was dealing almost in a matriarchal society. There were a lot of men that I knew that I was getting a great deal of money from, who died in the last few years, and the women have inherited that money. And that is going to increase, they tell me, considerably. So women play a big role. Now, they always played a role, don't get me wrong. The first scholarship given in the United States was in 1641 by a woman named Lady Anne Molson, who gave the scholarship to Harvard University. Women were always, during the American Revolution, during the Civil War, they set up organizations for the poor, the orphans, the widows, etc. But they formed Smith College, they did the women's colleges, they did money to hospitals, but they were very shy about getting PR about it. It is not so now. The women are just as eager as the men to get all the PR that they can get from their major gifts, and they are big players in your philanthropy. I'm not sure about how that is in Europe, but I suspect that it's moving more and more in that direction. And therefore, my general advice is that if you're going to run any campaign to raise money, you better involve the women in your area. In this country, I could look at a board and tell you whether that board, whether that organization will be in existence in 5 years. I look at the board and I see who's on it, and if there are no women on it, I know you're going to have trouble in the next years. I sit on the Committee of Character and Fitness for the New York Supreme Court, and I am amazed this year, 53% of the people who passed the New York bar were women. And I'm told that you have the same thing at the medical school. Although there's a different problem. The women are going into dermatology, radiology, things in which they're not on call all night. But you cannot ignore the increasing role of women in philanthropy. So those are some of the change that I have seen recently, and that accelerated. So now let me talk about effective fundraising. And let me tell you, it always bothers me that most people do not understand how important raising funds and philanthropy is, because without it, this country, and I suspect this is going to happen worldwide, will not be what it is. If you close your eyes for a minute and just think of the New York skyline, just New York alone, and take away Lincoln Center, the Metropolitan Opera, the Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Sloan Kettering Hospital, Columbia Presbyterian, NYU, Fordham, thousands of social work agencies that take care of the poor and the aged, they would not be here without fundraising, and this city skyline would be a very different place. And you could do this with every city in the United States. Philanthropy here has been a major force, and it reflects a particular approach to government. And I'll talk about whether this is a good model as against the European model. Don't get me wrong. There are many times I say to myself, do I want to be dependent on the Gates and the Buffetts and the Rockefellers for my museums? Wouldn't it be better to have a tax system like in Europe? And I can make an argument on both sides. But I'm telling you that in this country, philanthropy has been indispensable. Let me use the NYU example, how you raise money, because I think you're here to learn how to raise money. I'm not going to go into big philosophic discussions. I'm going to give you exactly what we did in NYU to go from raising $20 million in 1973 when we were on the verge of bankruptcy to now becoming one of the great global universities, raising $400 million a year for our university. And that didn't happen by a miracle, it happened by a process. It happened by principles that we followed. And it's those principles that I view as essential in raising funds. In the first thing that NYU did, and it was in very bad shape, they got a new president who wasn't an academic. He came out of McKinsey, which is a consulting business management firm. And he was a very tough guy. I hated him. He brought me in, but I must tell you, he was the worst man I ever worked for. But he saved the university. He made cuts, he did this, and he made fundraising his priority. And the first meeting he ever had was he brought the deans and all the faculty together, and he said, this is our priority. Everyone in this organization has to be involved in fundraising. He said, I and the fundraising staff can't do a thing if you, the faculty, don't come up with ideas and give us the means of going out and raising the money. Because let me tell you, you don't go and meet a donor and say, could you give me $100 million? That's not the way you raise money. You raise money by selling a project. You raise money by selling an idea that some people think is worth preserving. So he made it clear that everyone has to be involved. And if you belong to an organization in which your CEO says, well, I have a good development staff, and doesn't do anything, quit, because you cannot be successful. Everyone from the top down has to be involved in the fundraising process. The presidents of NYU spend at least a third of their time in raising money. And I will say the same thing at Harvard and Yale and Princeton, anywhere you go. The presidents and the deans and the faculty are involved. So the first principle is, please be sure that you get your president, your CEO involved. I just handed out 2 charts, so let me stop a minute and show you. One of the charts shows you where money generally comes from. And you will see that the bulk, here, I'm sorry, they Xerox where money went to. But if you had the right chart, which my efficient office didn't give me, you would see that the bulk of the money that you get comes from individuals. Individuals give the bulk of the money. They give 83% of any campaign. The second thing to keep in mind, and this chart is correct, this chart shows in any campaign, the bulk of the campaign comes from the big givers on the top. And this is nationally, or NYU, which is a reflection of national, 63% of our money came from gifts of $1 million or more. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't go after a little gift, because sometimes a little gift could be brought up to a big one. But don't deceive yourself. If you can't get some big gifts, and every organization has to decide what their big gifts will be, you're not going to make your campaign. So Dr. Sawhill, who was our first president, made clear he was going to go after big gifts, and everybody at NYU who is still working was going to have to come up with ideas. Second, he brought in, and how he got rid of the old chairman, I don't know, but he brought in a new chairman, Larry Tisch. Larry Tisch was one of the wealthiest billionaires in the country, a big businessman in New York, a graduate of NYU, and a very committed philanthropist. Now, I don't know what anyone is going to tell you later today, but in raising $2.5 billion, which I had the privilege of participating in 20 years, the bulk of that money didn't come because I'm a genius. I take all the accolades and the medals they give me, but I know I couldn't have raised a nickel without Mr. Tisch and the board that he put together. The board of your organization is absolutely indispensable. You can't go out, I don't care who you are, and raise the money all by yourself. You have to have some volunteers to open the doors, to give you leads. How was I? I'm not a rich lady. How was I going to know all those people? But it was that board that that he put together that opened those doors. Now, Mr. Tisch and my colleagues here have heard me say this, ran the board about what he called the 3 Gs. When you sit on an NYU board, you must give money, you must help get money, or you get off the board. Those are the 3 Gs. To sit on a board just because it looks nice in your eulogy in the Times, or it gives you a feeling of honor, is not a reason to sit on a board. You are fiduciarily responsible for that organization. You have to help keep it alive. You have to come to meetings. You have to listen to the audit report, as dull as it is. You have to go over the budget. You have to really be a player. And you have to make it clear to your boards that they have to be involved in the financial health of your organization. There's nothing ashamed in talking about money, you know. It's a strange society we live in. My girlfriends and I could go out and we will talk about everything. You'll talk about your children and your husband. You might even talk about sex. The one thing you don't talk about is, I have never asked a friend of mine, how much does your husband earn? Money is on a different level. People are shy about it. It isn't something that you talk about as easily as other things. But in fundraising, raising money involves money. And you have to be comfortable in recognizing that, and your board has to recognize it. I speak at various board meetings, and I look around the table and the board are lovely men and women. Nobody is involved in fundraising. I know that organization is not going to survive. It can't. And so you have to go back if you have board, and Mr. Tisch and the president didn't throw out of the board the people that weren't helping. You don't do that. You don't want to have fights with your board. But he brought in other people. He added people. And then you have to have a charter. And the charter, we have a charter that if you sit on a board, you could sit for 1 year, you could sit for 3 years, you can sit for 6. And if there are people who weren't giving money or weren't helping raise it, then when they were reelected, they'd be reelected for 1 year and then they'd be off the board. All that sounds very harsh. You'll hear later on in discussions very polite approaches to this issue. You don't raise big money by being polite about money. You raise money by recognizing your organization cannot exist without it. It cannot exist without it. And my goodness, this foundation could tell you that. They do a lot of wonderful things. I am very impressed with what you do, and you really should get all kinds of medals. But you couldn't do a nickel without the money that you received. And I stress that because people are very shy about that when they talk about organizations. And here, we give a course in our Center for Philanthropy called The Art of the Ask. And there are ways that you ask for money, and there are ways that you don't. And Mr. Tisch, forgive me if I use his name all the time, he died 2 years ago. He was my right arm, and as I said, I could have done nothing without his help. He said to me, the quicker you ask, the less you get. And so you don't rush for a big gift. No one is going to meet you on Monday and Tuesday give you $1 million. It doesn't work that way. The whole principle of good fundraising is developing relationships. You have to make people trust you, they have to like you, they have to believe in what you're selling. And what are you doing? You are salespeople. You're selling concepts. And we used to have a process where if we had somebody who we thought had the potential for a big gift because of our research, we take them for breakfast. We would always have our breakfast at the Regency because Mr. Tisch owned the hotel. We didn't have to pay for breakfast. And the first meeting was not a meeting where you talked about money. You talked about, Mr. Shorin, how was your business? How did you get into that business? And Larry would talk that way about everything. What do you think about the economic crisis? And everything. Because while he was doing that, my job was to listen. What is it that that person is really interested in? What button are you going to push to make them kind of give money? I'll let you in on a secret. We had a process which really, as I look back on it, wasn't very nice, but it worked all the time. That kind of conversation was going on for about, we have an 8 o'clock breakfast meeting, and at 10 minutes to 9, Larry would say to me, oh, Naomi, we haven't talked about NYU at all. And why don't you tell Mr. Shorin a little bit about NYU? And I would look at my watch, and I was scripted down to the last dot, and I would say, you know, it's almost 9 o'clock, and there's so much that we're doing. I really, Mr. Shorin, would it be possible for you to come down to the university to see for yourself what we're doing? And Larry would say, what a good idea. He'd pull out his calendar and say, I'll send my car and chauffeur. Tell me, Mr. Shorin, when would you like to go with me? Now, he's telling the guy he's sending his car and chauffeur, anytime, it's very hard for Mr. Shorin to say, I haven't got a single day in the next year to go with you. So we always got, 90%, we always got the person down there. And if I was listening carefully, I would find out what is Shorin really interested in. I discovered in that case, he, even though he was a big businessman, he owned Topps with those baseball cards, which he just sold to Michael Eisner for $45 million. He wasn't interested in business. He was interested in music. So when we brought him down to the university, we had to meet the dean of the Tisch School of the Arts. We had students there from the music department. We would fashion a meeting around what I had learned by listening at that meeting. I tell you this, you're not gonna do it, but I tell you because the principle is the same. And the principle is you have to find out what the person is interested in. And then you have to come and sell an idea. You don't ask for money. You come and sell an idea. You're selling something. Are you gonna improve the environment by doing something in water? Are you gonna ask for money for oncology, or like Mrs. Hassenfeld's 50 million, or for a center to handle children with cancer? Why did we go to her to ask for a center for children with cancer? Because she's the owner of Hasbro Toys. Toys deal with children. You have to make connections. Why would she be interested in that? Mrs. Kimmel's husband spent a lot of time at our hospital, and he was sick with various things. Well, her 65 million is going to a new pavilion at NYU Hospital. But you have to know those things. And they always say to me, what qualifications go into making a good fundraiser? I don't give a damn about whether you read the Philanthropy, the Chronicle of Philanthropy and all kinds of books on fundraising. I am most interested in whether you are an interesting human being. If I don't want to have lunch with you, nobody wants to have lunch with you. And if they don't want to have lunch with you, they don't want to relate to you, you're never going to get them to trust you or to like you. I want you to read. I want you to read, there's a new book that came out on World War II. That just came out. It's a terrific book. And I want you to be able to talk about that. All the mistakes that Hitler made, he could have won that war. He made 4 major mistakes. I could have a wonderful lunch talking about that. I could talk about the campaign. I could talk about Romney. Because I come out of the AJ Congress, I could talk about women's rights, civil rights, integration, the problems that we had in the South. I could talk about Israel. I could talk about the Middle East. You name it, I could talk. Doesn't mean I know anything, but I could talk about it. And I find that if you're that kind of person, if you read and you're knowledgeable, you make a better fundraiser, because I enjoy going, and you have to like people, and you'd be surprised what interesting human beings they are. The fact that they made a lot of money means in some way that they are intelligent, risk-taking, interesting human beings. I'll tell you one story, and it really, how much time do I have? I don't know.
Oh, plenty of time. Still have half an
I
hour.
went to meet a man named Arthur Belfor, and he was an elderly man in his 80s, and I said to him, oh, it's gonna be a very boring meeting, I can tell already from the background. And yet, I didn't know anything about Arthur Belfor. This is a man who was a feather salesman in Poland. And he used to go out every morning with a little box or suitcase to sell feathers. And at 3 o'clock every day, he'd call his wife if should he bring home something. This time she said, don't come home, Arthur. The Nazis are not far from the village. If I were you, I'd go through the forest and go to Uncle so-and-so and so-and-so. The wife and children were killed, and Arthur took him a year. He got through all the woods in Poland, Germany, wherever he went, and finally he arrived at a port in Paris to get to the United States. He came here with nothing but a suitcase of feathers and maybe a few dollars in his pocket. He was met at the boat by Hyas. That's an organization the Jewish community had that met the refugees that came from Germany. And they got him a room, and they got him a job in a feather factory, because the man there spoke Yiddish. Arthur could only speak Polish and Yiddish. And every payday, Arthur would take half of his money and buy feathers and store it in a warehouse. And people thought he was a nut. What kind of man who could barely dress right, could barely pay his rent, buy feathers? And Arthur said to me, he said, I knew the United States was going to enter this war. And why would they need feathers if they entered the war? Let me see if you would become billionaires. Why do you think they would need feathers if they entered the war?
Do you wear covers for the soldiers?
Every single sleeping bag that was made for an American soldier was made by Arthur Belfor. He went to Washington when war was declared and bid on the sleeping bag contract. Well, all the other guys had bought the feathers now for a lot of money because people all knew that, but Arthur already had it when he bought it for next to nothing. So he bid on the contract and got the lowest, and then they said to him, Arthur, do you have a factory? He said, of course I have a factory. He ran back to New York, he got about 30 women refugees, he rented sewing machines in a warehouse, and he had a factory. And every single sleeping bag was made by Arthur Belfor. At the end of the war, his friend said to him, Arthur, it's enough already with the sleeping bags. We're going to Texas to buy oil wells. And Arthur said, I let them fly. He said, I took the bus. And by that time, he could read English. And I read every single book on oil. Every book I read. When I got to Texas, I said, I'm not buying oil wells in Texas. They said, why? He said, because I read that the best oil was offshore. And the best oil right now is offshore in Peru. Now, this is a guy that didn't know where Peru was. I mean, believe me, he didn't know it, but he took a plane, went to Peru, and he said, I knew that the government there wasn't gonna know too much, and he said, I said to them, look, I'll put the machinery, I'll do everything, and I'll give you a third of everything I make. And they figured the guy was a nut. They said, fine. I want you to know that became Belco oil, which then became Sunoco, okay? And that's a man who had feathers. So when you meet these people, it's exciting. I could tell you 100 such stories, but you have to be able to listen and to understand and be the kind of person, they want to have dinner with you and they want to tell you about their life. So you have to have a president or CEO who tells everybody fundraising is everybody's job. Second, you have to put a board together that understands that they must fundraise. Now later today you'll hear from Doug White, and he will tell you all about the fiduciary and legal responsibilities of board. That's very important. In my book, the critical issue is whether that board is going to be willing to help you keep your organization alive financially. The other thing that Tish told me was you don't raise money by postage stamps, you raise it by shoe leather. And that means meeting after meeting after meeting. If you write a letter, you're gonna get $50, $100, $5,000. But if you're really gonna develop relationships and get to the top of the triangle, you have to meet the people. You have to be prepared to have meetings after meeting, and it's hard to get the meetings. They're gonna turn you down many times, but every so often you're gonna get it, and it's those meetings at which you're going to be able to raise money. Now, I don't know what your role is in your organization, but all I'm telling you is that if you don't get involved in helping your organization keep alive, you won't have an organization. And you have to always keep that in mind, that you have to help. And it's at the meetings that you learn about the person and their interests and whether or not they are willing to be involved in fundraising. By the way, fundraising is not today just selling cookies for the Girl Scouts. It is and should be viewed as a profession, and it isn't. No mother wakes up in the morning and says, sweetheart, I want you to grow up and be a fundraiser. That doesn't happen, and it's a shame, because without the fundraisers who are raising the money, these organizations and the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Lincoln Center and all the things you're gonna see would not exist. To the shame of my life, every time I visit my mother in the last years of her life at Kittay House, a senior residency, she'd say to me, darling, when we go down for lunch and anyone asks you what you do for a living, tell them you're a lawyer, not a fundraiser. My own mother was ashamed that her law review editor was now raising money. And that attitude, in some way, has to be changed. I created the Hyman Center for Philanthropy and Fundraising in the hope that if a great university like NYU would have a center that gave courses that met our academic requirements, somehow we would help raise the level of fundraising. And the one thing that John Sawhill did when he became president was he made fundraising the fundraisers very important. I was the second highest paid employee of NYU. And that was done deliberately to show everyone, fundraising is as important as being a professor in archaeology. And he made that very clear. Those professors wouldn't have their chairs without me getting the money for them to have a chair. They wouldn't have a laboratory if it wasn't for us who gave them a laboratory. They wouldn't have dormitories that brought in students from all over the world. So never underestimate or look down upon the people who are gonna raise money for you. Now, Europe. I want to say a word about Europe, because the last time I spoke to the group, Europe was just about waking up to its fundraising responsibilities and sending people here, quote, to learn the American model. In my classes, we give 40 classes at the Hyman Center. I would say about a third today have people from abroad, which we never had before. And we have them, I must tell you, from Japan, from China, from Korea, and all over Europe. Right now, in the research I did last night, it shows that there are 2 million, almost 2 million nonprofit organizations in Europe today. And fundraising has now become a subject of conversation. I was invited, there's a big conference in Madrid in October, isn't that October, a big conference in Madrid of all the universities, et cetera, all over the world, all over Europe, to come and talk about fundraising. In Great Britain, they have appointed Dame Stephanie Shirley. They've appointed her, as they call her, the philanthropic ambassador. And she travels all over the world and all over Great Britain, trying to influence the rich British people in giving to philanthropy. In Spain, there are 175,000 nonprofit associations and 6,000 foundations, but most of these, and this is what surprised me, Germany, by the way, has one of the most highly developed nonprofit sectors, and France and the UK has 225,000 nonprofits, but in most of the cases, more than 60% are supported by the government. The rest, they have lotteries, they have service charges. Actual philanthropy, the way I'm talking about it, is meeting you for lunch and saying, please give me, etc. That's still outside of what Dame Shirley is doing, very much on the back burner. But they're coming here, they are coming here in great numbers to learn. Now let me talk about the American model so you're not deceived about it. I should tell you that George Washington, in his farewell address to Congress in 1796, was very upset that a group of men had come together in a nonprofit association to fight the whiskey tax, and it was called in American history the Whiskey Rebellion. And George Washington said, in our country, we see how a nonprofit organization with lots of money and intensive ideologies is, quote, usurping the power of government. Now keep in mind that in many ways, nonprofits here, in their own way, are usurping the power of government. And let me give you an example. I happen not to be wild about charter schools. They may be good, but I'm a product of the public school system. And I think charter schools will destroy public education in this country. That's my personal opinion. Bill Gates is spending $31 billion in supporting charter school movements in this country. Would George Washington say, I didn't elect Bill Gates? Is Bill Gates usurping the power of government? And so we have, I always, don't forget, I teach the American model, and I'm ashamed to say this, but I say it anyway, that I worry about that. I worry about the fact that our museums couldn't exist today without the Rockefellers and the Guggenheims and Shelby White and others who support it. Would I be better off with the European system of having the taxes higher? But yet, the bad side is that when you have economic crisis, governments can't support, and then your libraries and museums suffer. I taught 2 years at Oxford when I was doing a book, and I used the Bodleian Library. I was shocked at the condition of that library. Margaret Thatcher had cut back on money for higher ed, and that library was 100 years behind the libraries in the United States. I would have to come in the morning with my piece of paper listing what I wanted and give it to a lady or man, and come back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to get the book or the letter I needed. Today, Oxford has an office in New York, Cambridge has an office in New York, and they're all raising money, and that library has gone from here to here because of private fundraising. So I'm not happy with the European model because I know what happens when the government cuts back. I'm not exactly wild about the American model also. But I tell myself, and you should keep in mind, that the American model really is a combination of private philanthropy and government, because nonprofit organizations get, for example, universities and hospitals get enormous money from the government. NYU Hospital gets a terrific amount of money for medical research and all kinds of Medicare and other things that the government helps. NYU University gets all kinds of money from the government in research grants and scholarship, etc. And the National Council for the Arts gives a lot of money that's paid for by Washington that helps support the art world in it. So we have really a combination. We have a modified system here. And don't forget, our tax system gives enormous benefits to our nonprofits. So we are helping them. We're helping them in many ways. I could show you in one of my classes how if you give a charitable lead trust, you can give me $10 million, and at the end of the trust, you get your $10 million back, I'll get my $10 million, and the tax advantages to you are enormous. So we really have in this country a modified system. And I think that we could learn from you, and you can learn from us. It isn't a one-way street. I think that it's going to change in Europe because, don't forget, I've only talked about individuals. But if you're really in a good campaign, you're going to get money from foundations, you're going to get money from corporations. By the way, our foundation system is really marvelous. You have a foundation that could do whatever it wants. It could take risks. It could be creative. The first 9/11 emergency system, you know, if you have an emergency in this country, you dial 911 and they send an ambulance right away. That was set up in Alabama in 1868 by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They created the idea, and then the rest of the country developed it. Now it's all over. The Janine Bank in India and microfinancing, that came from the Rockefeller Foundation. They created that idea. We have here something called public radio, which you get it's the best system of, the rest is commercial radio, and you get a lot of ads and a lot of junk. Public radio is very good. That is supported by Carnegie and the Ford and other foundations. The Pell Grants also were developed by a foundation. Community Development Corporation, Rockefeller itself and the buildings you're in. The Rockefeller Foundation has done more in molecular biology than anybody else, and I can go on and on of the things that our foundations did. So don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting our system is a bad system, but I'm saying that there are things to always be concerned about. I think that American businessmen who now are in Europe, they will bring with them social corporate responsibility of American corporations who give to charity, and that may spread in Europe. Foundations are now giving overseas, and I think that will set an example. And American students, all of them, are spending from any major university time overseas. And they will bring their ideas of philanthropy also to the countries abroad. So my message to you is that yes, you can learn a lot from the American model, but we can learn a lot from you. And that's why conferences like this are so important, because it isn't a time for you to come here and learn from American so-called experts on the list. It's a time to exchange ideas. We can learn as much from you as you can learn from us. So thank you for listening to me. Do I take questions?
We still have about 15 minutes if you do have time for questions.
I will take questions if they're easy. I can't
An easy
answer.
one.
Yes.
I was doing for my organization with which is Institut Curie in Paris.
Institut Curie, she works for Institut Curie,
From
established by Marie
Marie
Curie.
Curie.
You know Marie Curie?
Yes, of
This-
course. Yes.
So,
Yeah, I'm 89 years and my hearing is not great, so you have to talk loud.
so I was wondering, because I was doing that triangle, if the top big gifts in my country are not government grants, because I would say 99% is of the money comes from the low on the triangle. And the rich people I meet, and it can be billionaires, and I meet some, they give me 100,000 euros. Maybe I'm very bad fundraiser.
No. Well, you know,
To pay taxes, to
yeah,
pay
you
taxes.
have, it takes time to develop a cultural pattern. And it depends who you're asking. And the truth is that I always thought you should ask low, so you shouldn't be disappointed. But Mr. Tisch said, no, people are flattered if you ask here, because then they think you think you're that rich. So ask on the top, and if they don't give you and they come down, they come down. But it's your fault for asking too little. You have to be able to tell them that what your organization does is absolutely critical. You've done some of the most marvelous research in the world, which is true. And therefore, they should be prepared to support that, not with $10, but with $50.
And they reply by taxes, and next election where there will be tax at 75%.
Well,
So they're not ready to give big amounts.
I know it's hard.
The good thing about high taxes is that when you make a tax deductible gift, obviously, what you pay is
You have
is
to
less.
talk to your government, and they're doing this in Great Britain, about the tax systems. And they're beginning to do a lot of this in Britain. You have a 75% tax, but if you give to charity, don't forget, when I give a gift to charity, I could take it off my income tax. Well, that's very nice. It helps me. And you have to be able to persuade people in your government that philanthropy would help them in the long run if they made it advantageous. Yes.
I guess it's the president or the man on the top, the person at the top, who does the ask.
Does he ask?
It's a question. Is he or she the one who does the
Yes.
ask?
Sometimes.
Or have you ever experienced a case that the fundraiser does the ask?
I never did the ask. I could, except after a while, there were certain people I knew intimately and I could. But generally, either the on a major gift, the president or the chairman of the board did the asking. I was at the meeting, I listened, I answered questions, but I didn't do the actual ask. And the president did it, but many times he didn't like to do it. So the chairman of the board or somebody from the board. Now, by the way, in New York, Mr. Tisch said, on the board go only members of the fire group. Our board represents only the fire group. What's the fire group? The fire group is finance, insurance, and real estate. He said that's what New York is. But it's beginning to change. And technology is now going to start coming in here. Our board has on it the heads of all the banks, all the insurance companies, all the realtors. We have Larry Silverstein, we have Louis Rudin's son. We have all the realtors because that's where the money was in New York. Now it's beginning to change. But no, if we were going to ask Lou Rudin, big realtor, for money, we would have not only Mr. Tisch in real estate, but Larry Silverstein in real estate, and Larry would do the ask, because the guys in real estate know how rich the other guys are. So they're able to say, you know, Mr. Rudin, you could give us $5 million. And we would do that. The fundraiser, and by the way, there's no single way to raise money. I'm telling you the way we did it. I happen to believe this is the best way, but other people have other ways. In some places, fundraisers ask for money, but we did not do that, and I don't believe that that's the best way. Yes?
You described how you got someone with Mr. Tisch to come to a second meeting. Can you tell me how you get to get them to a third meeting?
The third meeting?
Yeah.
Well, it depends, it's an important question, what you do at the second meeting. If at the second meeting, I'll do Arthur Shorin again, people told him about our music program and told him about this and told him, and then the dean of our school of music said to him, you know, Mr. Shorin, we are having some concerts in the next year, would you like to attend? And then you involve them. Involvement is the secret. If people aren't involved, they're not gonna give. So you invite them to something that they might be interested. Mrs. Kimmel is interested in medicine. They have a big colloquium on the new research in cancer. We will invite her. And so the third meeting is usually involving them in something. Putting them even on an advisory board. Every school had an advisory board. Would you, Mr. Shorin, you're interested in music, would you like to serve on the board? We only meet a few times a year. It won't be a burden on you, you know, that kind of involvement. You had your hand up in the back.
Yes, thank you very much. We have the possibility in the Prince Claus Fund to have a kind of a fundraising dinner once a year. And the discussion in the board is whether to invite only people who already give or also potential givers. What would you say about that?
I think potential givers should always be there. But let me tell you about special events. And I am a minority here. Mr. Tisch told me, you never make money on a special event, at a dinner, etc. Because write it down. Say you sell 500 tickets at $1,000 each. That brings in 500,000 gross. Then you pay for the flowers, the liquor, the food, the room, the entertainment, and that's 200,000 off the 500. So then you're left with 300, and that doesn't count the amount of hours that your staff is on the phone calling 500 people to get them to fill a room. He said it's very good to have events for PR because they show off your organization, they bring in new people. But he said they're never money makers at the end. I could get more in one breakfast than you spending 5 months in running a dinner. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have it. And I would invite all potential, because you never know. You never know. Fundraising is you never know.
I have a question.
Loud.
I have a question specifically for chairs. And when you're going to bring in a chair, do you approach the company just to find out generally what they might be interested in? Or do you go specifically selling a faculty member or a subject already?
No, I never, unless the faculty member is a Nobel Prize winner, mostly we sell what they're doing,
Yeah.
what they're teaching. If they're working on cancer research, if they're working in the field, Shelby White, one of our very big donors, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum, you'll see that there is a Shelby White, Leon Levy gallery for Greek, Roman, and Egyptian artifacts. Well, when we get money from Shelby, we created an Institute for Ancient Study, because that's what her interest is. We didn't talk about a particular faculty member, although we will say, and we have Mr. So-and-so, who is one of the great experts, but the idea always comes first, certainly in my mind. When I'm gonna give money, it's to something that interests me.
Would you go with a couple, a different, if you were setting up centers for CSR or for innovation, do you go with, we have these 2 or 3, or do you go specifically
Well,
with
our
one?
research is such that we know Shelby's interested in Greek, Roman
Okay,
architect. I mean, I will know before I go to a meeting what the person is interested in.
Yeah.
Otherwise, my research is so bad, I can't do my job.
okay.
And don't economize on your research department. Today, I must tell you, the technology is fabulous. And by the way, I don't know anything about social media. I don't like it. I don't understand why anyone wants to Twitter their life away or go on Facebook. When my husband died, I couldn't sleep alone. Big shot like me. I walked around all night, couldn't go to sleep. I was married 55 years. And so someone sent me a young girl who had just broken up with her boyfriend and she had no place to stay. So Sarah has lived with me. As soon as she comes into the house, she goes to her internet. Her whole life is whatever she's doing with Facebook, Twitter, and now if she breaks up with a boyfriend, she doesn't go out and have a drink with him and say, darling, I don't love you anymore. What is that, the text message? There's something called a text message. Dear Bob, I don't love you anymore, goodbye. Unheard of. But she lives in that world. Now, we have just hired at NYU, for the Hyman Center. By the way, I didn't introduce my associate director, who is sitting there quietly and not taking me on, Angie Hyman. Angie and I just hired a woman who is an expert in social media. And we put the Hyman Center on whatever it is we're on, because unless we're on those things, people don't know about you. And that's a method of getting your message across. And, you know, breaks my heart that she doesn't go out with the guy and uses a text message, but I guess there are advantages. Yes, ma'am.
You touched upon a topic, and I think part of the problem in Europe, at least, and in my institution, is that the president is afraid by receiving money from private individuals or private institutions that he will be dictated what to do. And part of his big fright is that it will distort the mission of the museum itself. And by listening too much, you come to do things you wouldn't have done.
No, you have to make it clear when you get a gift that it comes in a way that it does not tell you what to do. In the academic world, and I'll tell you, Shelby White is one of our best examples. She gave us $200 million, that's a lot of money, to create a center in ancient studies. She knows more about that world than nearly any faculty member, and she wanted to be on the committee to help choose a director. And the university was prepared to turn that money down because they have a method of how an academic committee has to come together to choose the director of a center. And therefore, they would not let her sit on that committee. They did let her, they compromised, sit on the committee with no vote. She could just express her opinion and then be quiet. So you have to be careful. You have to turn down money, and I don't know whether you'll discuss it, but the most important class that I give is a class on ethics, because once your organization is tainted with any unethical behavior on any level, you're lost. And you've read in the papers where the heads of organizations have used money improperly, or that they give excess salaries, or they do something unethical. Do not ever accept money that will come to you unethically. Can I take 2 more minutes?
Sure.
For example, I got many, many millions of dollars from Larry Tisch to name our hospital. It is called Tisch Hospital. If you go down First Avenue, you'll see all the signs. I thought I was a heroine. I came back to the office so happy and proud. The next day there were pickets in front of my office and the president's office with all kinds of carrying on. Why? It never dawned on me ethically to think about the fact that 1/3 of his money came from Lorelei Tobacco. How could you, that was in those anti-tobacco years, how could you name a hospital with cigarette money? There's no law, but there's some ethical thing. We never talked ethics in my department. We would talk, how much money did you raise? What are the prospects? Well, I took the issue to the Board of Trustees. We have a rule at NYU. If the money is made legally and doesn't come with any strings, we will accept it. Because otherwise it's a slippery slope. Do I take money from the automobile companies? Because they had the electric technology way before Nissan and Toyota, and they sold it there, and they're polluting the air as much as cigarettes. Do I take money from the alcohol world, from the beer distributors? I know women who are beat up because a man is drunk. I don't know anyone beat up because he smoked a cigarette. So once you start making all kinds of distinctions, it's a slippery slope. So our rule is, if the money is made legally. The Puck building on Houston Street, one of the great buildings in New York, was given to NYU. Was given by Charlie Kushner, who then was indicted and sent to jail. We gave the building back so that if you are indicted or anything illegal, we won't touch it. Otherwise, we will take it. But ethical issues. I was in the office of John Brown, Mr. President, when the King of Spain, Juan Carlos, called him and said that his finance minister was prepared to give $10 million to the Stern School of Business if they would take in his son. And John said they would give it to the academic committee at the Stern School, who turned it down. I, in those years, was very square. You can't buy your way into a university. I hated the idea. But then later on, somebody pointed out to me, they said, Naomi, say you have a class of 25 very bright students and one dumbbell, but the dumbbell's father gave you $10 million, so 100 other students, poor kids who never could go to school, could get an education. Ethically, which is the right way to go? I'm not sure of the answer, and I'm not, but I tell you, ethical issues should be discussed. They should be part of what you're doing, and never do anything that in your heart you know is something that's not ethical. How you define that, it's, to me, ethics are almost like pornography. I can't describe it, but when I see it, I know it. And so in ethics, it's the same thing. I don't know always what to say, but I know when it's right and wrong, most of the time. Never ignore the ethical issues.
Now, one question, a follow-up question, Naomi, regarding the ethics. You were referring to tobacco money to support the building of the hospital. I guess that in terms of the ethics, you were referring to individuals contributing monies, because I'm quite sure that if Marlborough was coming to see NYU saying, well, can we name it the Marlborough Hospital, then that would have
we will never
opened
do
another
that.
debate.
That is an example of, right on target, another case I faced, Ronald Perlman, who owns, what is that?
Revlon.
Revlon. He owns Revlon, and he came to us and asked us to name the Department of Dermatology, the Revlon Department of Dermatology. I happen, it's very personal with me, to believe that that whole world of cosmetics is built on a bunch of slick advertising, and half of it are lies. You could put that stuff on your face from now till Christmas, you're gonna get wrinkles. I did not want to see the name of Revlon given the credibility of dermatology. So I brought it to the board, and they happened to agree with me. And if you go down First Avenue, it's called the Perlman Department of Dermatology. It is not named after Revlon. We would never name a hospital after a cigarette company. That I can tell you.
Thank you. Last short question, David.
I'll be very short. Can I just say that your enthusiasm is really, really great. You mentioned quickly about social media and all the involving new technologies. My university in Scotland, we invested quite a considerable amount in that. But you're stressing the engagement of people. From going from initially meeting somebody to getting that major gift, how many people would you have? How many prospects? And how long would it take you to achieve that gift on average? I don't know if there's a
How long?
specific one.
Yeah. The list of prospects that you were working on, how long would that list be, and how long would it take to kind of finalize a deal, if I may say, if I understand your question correctly?
I think I get it. Well, it depends, really. It depends on the organization. Our database is very big because we are a very big university. We have a lot of alumni, although a lot of our money came from people who didn't go to NYU. In the beginning, we didn't have a rich alumni, and that's improving. So you get as large a base as you could put together, thinking, and by the way, on foundations, I don't know about in Europe, but you can use it here. We have the Foundation Center on 17th Street that has everything you want to know about foundations and what they give money to. You should visit that while you're here And they will be very nice to you, and they will give you all the information you need to know about what foundations are giving overseas. There's a lot of American foundations, not only Rockefeller, Ford, Pew, or I can go down a list, and you should know them. Are they giving to your country and giving to your project? How long does it take? Sometimes it'll take a year. With the Kimmels, it took a year, and sometimes it could be shorter. It depends so much on each individual case. In closing, I want to tell you something. My mother used to ask me every time I visited, what do you do? She knew what a lawyer did. She never could figure out what a fundraiser did. What do you do? And I got very impatient, and one day I said to her, listen, Ma, I said, I have breakfast at the Regency, I have lunch at the Regency, I have dinner at the Regency, then someone dies and leaves me money in a bequest. So she said, you know, if that's what you do, why don't you have breakfast at Cathay House? More people die here than at the Regency. I'm just telling you that that's the way you raise money through bequests in wills.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Naomi. I think you did it again. I think that I don't want to influence the vote, but I think that we'll get close to the 100%. I am sure, if not past the 100%.
No, but seriously, try to visit the Foundation Center.
Mhm.
And if any of you, Angie will give you the email address I have. This is a very superficial presentation. So if you have any questions or anything like that, email me, or you can even call me if you still use telephones. She'll give you my phone number. Don't text message me. Don't text message me, I don't like that.
Thank you, sir. What I would also like to do is to encourage you to visit the website of the Hyman Center at NYU, because
And
obviously
take courses.
they have wonderful courses on fundraising, different aspects that go more in depth than the 3 days we have. So thank you so much, Naomi.